name's Maguire. Do I click the little buzzer? I probably do. Yep. Okay, great. I direct the Inside Out Institute for Eating Disorders, which is part of the Bowden collaboration here at the Charles Perkins Centre. Obviously, we're partners in this story and in this journey. And I've been asked to speak to our relationship with food today. Our interactions with food really are best described as a relationship, defined in the dictionary as the way in which things are connected or work together, the way in which they regard and behave towards each other. It's the first thing you do upon entering the world, besides perhaps a little cuddle, then 3 times a day for a lifetime. It is a relationship that truly spans the cradle to the grave. And without food, the grave comes a lot earlier. And unfortunately, in some of the worst relationships with food, that is exactly what we see, an unacceptably high mortality rate. And when we can think about anorexia nervosa in one of these cases, but it affects all the eating disorders. And in anorexia nervosa, an illness where the individual somehow overrides the most basic of biological drives, to eat, to consume enough calories to remain in balance, and in which over time the brain and the body accommodate so extensively that even in the face of imminent and unwanted death, the individual is unable to reassert control and to eat. It is hard to think of a more deranged relationship with food, although there are numerous. And what is the nature of the food relationship for most of us? What are its characteristics? It involves sustenance, it involves nourishment. Food is emotional. The relationship can be passionate, it involves drive, and it can involve obsession. Characteristics to many of our core relationships. Your brain and all its activities are powered by food. The relationship is essential. Feeding is one of the first tasks a child tries to assert control over, and the individuation period of adolescence, it's one of the first areas of life where individuation is usually achieved in the healthy trajectory. Food is part of family, friends, fun, comfort, all of the connected and emotion-laden aspects of our life. And as such, it is part of our mental life. Food and food cues, as Tim has so well addressed, are everywhere. We are relating to food all day long. It is not just 3 meals a day. The food environment is ubiquitous. Eating disorders at a psychological level have as no small contributor deprivation and control. And the interplay then between an environment saturated with highly palatable food and food images, which at the same time worships the thin ideal, where fat is a moral failure, where exercise is a virtue always, when for many it is not, where self-restraint is glorified, and a perceived lack of self-restraint met with disgust. Can there be any more toxic a background for any of us? Is it any surprise that all of us battle with our relationship with food across the lifespan, and that for many it reaches disorder and disability? So we see the full spectrum of dysfunctional relationships played out: extreme deprivation and punitiveness, ascetic control to the point of critical illness. For most of us, however, deprivation doesn't work very well. Our biological drive reasserts itself to meet our basic nutritional needs. And then in the case of eating disorders that swing between periods of virtuous restriction and biological urges to compensate for that deprivation with binging and storing calories, as we are programmed to do, for the next period of starvation or restriction. In fact, in a society saturated with food and food cues, it is arguable deprivation doesn't work well psychologically for any of us. We need satiety. We seek pleasure. So the relationship with food becomes a constant struggle between the ceaseless exposure to calorie-dense stimuli, highly palatable foods, and the internal metric around personal worth and moral fortitude being derived from thinness and restraint. And then our biological drive for satiety, pleasure, and food security. Little surprise then that food is intimately connected with the reward circuitry in our brains. We know that exposure to highly palatable foods and what we call obesity itself are both associated with activation of the primary mesolimbic components of the reward pathways. and that this involvement of the reward circuitry can look very similar to that which we see in other forms of addiction. The vicious cycle of dependence is sustained here. And then at the other end of the disordered food relationships, the reward circuitry is also disrupted. People with anorexia nervosa don't experience basic rewards such as pleasure from food and a soft bed in the same way as other people. Body weight free fall in rat models of anorexia nervosa can actually be prevented with activation of the reward circuitry. It is thought that for people with anorexia, when you lose weight, your brain rewards response actually does go up, but instead of driving eating, it actually drives anxiety, leading to further restriction and a vicious cycle. The artificial separation of concerns, disorder and disability relating to food is something we all in this room are striving to eliminate. We need to think about the concerns we describe as eating disorders and those we label as overweight and obesity as related. They often co-occur. All bodies are at risk of an eating disorder and all bodies need to navigate our environment. Thank you.